All right, next up we want to talk about biological evolution. So the first true cells were prokaryotes, meaning that they lack a membrane-bound nucleus. From these evolved eukaryotic cells, which would have a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. Now, the very first eukaryotic cells would have been single-celled protists. The protists gave rise to multicellularity and the other kingdoms, like fungi, plants, and animals. All life has undergone biological evolution. There are two very important aspects to biological evolution: descent from a common ancestor and adaptation to the environment. Descent from original cell explains why all of life has a common chemistry and a common cellular structure. Adaptation allows an organism to survive and reproduce in its environment. So Charles Darwin was an English scientist, naturalist, who first presented the concept of natural selection, or descent with modification. He formulated his ideas while sailing around the world on the HMS Beagle between 1831 and 1836. Now, the most significant contribution was to describe the mechanism for adaptation, or natural selection. Darwin's natural selection is contrasted with a process described by Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He was another 19th century naturalist who proposed the idea that species are going to change over time in response to their environment. Now, the way his theory worked was his theory was the inheritance of acquired characteristics. He believed that giraffes had long necks because their ancestors tried to reach into the trees to eat. So what happened is we had short-necked giraffes. They reached up into the trees to eat, and as they reached, their necks stretched and grew just a little bit. Their offspring were then born with slightly longer necks. Their offspring were born with slightly longer necks, and as these generations continued to stretch, over time their necks became longer and longer. Here's the thing, though. Acquired characteristics cannot really be inherited, which we now know. Through the inheritance of genetic material, we know that things that happen to you over the course of your life cannot really be passed down from one generation to the next. Meaning that if you were to break your leg, or let's say not even break your leg, let's say you were to lose your leg in a car accident, would all of your children after that accident be born without one leg? No. If something happens to you during the course of your life, you're not going to necessarily pass those characteristics on to your offspring. If you decide to shave your head bald, your children are not necessarily going to be born bald and never grow hair. Things that happen in your lifetime, unless they impact your sex cells, unless they impact your gametes directly, they're not going to affect your offspring. But Darwin took that idea, he looked at that, okay, so populations sort of change over time in response to their environment. And so he took those ideas and he reapplied them, and he published a book in 1859. He published a book called On the Origin of Species, about natural selection and evolution. His theory was that at one time, the population of giraffes contained multiple different neck lengths. So some were born with short necks, some with medium necks, some with long necks. Those who had the longest necks were able to reach the freshest food sources. They were able to be the healthiest and pass on their genes to future generations. So tall-necked giraffes had lots of food sources, had lots of mating opportunities. They gave birth to tall offspring. The taller the offspring of each generation, the greater their likelihood for reproduction and passing their genetic traits on to the next generation. There are a few main points of natural selection that we want to cover. The first is variation. Vary in the idea that individuals are going to vary in their physical characteristics that can be passed on. So some individuals are going to be born with short necks, some with long necks, some with medium-sized necks. But due to competition for limited resources, so even though those individuals may produce multiple offspring, the overall population size is going to stay the same due to limited resource, which is going to create competition. There is only so many trees and leaves available for the population of giraffes. And specifically, that tree or the population of leaves is going to be found up high. So it's going to be very competitive for those who can get those resources. and survive to pass their genes on to the next generation. Adaptation. This is the idea that members of the population with advantageous traits are going to capture more resources and are going to be much more likely to reproduce. So over time, the environment is going to select for better adapted traits. In this case, the environment is tall trees with food sources up high. Over time, because of that food source, we're going to see the populations of giraffes change and become more specific. Now, we can actually reproduce this concept of natural selection through a process known as artificial selection. Artificial selection is simply breeding of animals with particular traits. Desired traits are going to increase in frequency in the next generations. So, for example, prehistoric humans noted desirable traits in wolves and selected individuals for breeding. They were looking specifically for wolves that maybe were a little bit less aggressive, wolves that were maybe friendlier with humans, wolves that had really good, strong pack instincts and were very loyal to their leaders, wolves that had some of these particular traits could have been selected for breeding, and over time, wolves would have been domesticated. After a while, and domesticated for humans to coexist with. And of course, over time, we have selected those animals. We've selected those dogs over the course of many, many, many generations to create all of the different breeds of dogs that you see. So there are many different types of evidence that support that organisms once had a common ancestor. Scientists widely recognize evolution as a core theory in biology due to the overwhelming evidence. Some of the evidence that exists out there is the fossil record. Fossils are one of the best sources of evidence for evolution. The remains of species that lived at least 10,000 years ago and up to 1 billion years ago. And there are a lot of different things that can be fossils. So not just like dead bones, but things like trails, footprints, burrows, worm casts, preserved droppings, pieces of bone, impressions of plants and shale, insects trapped in tree resin. All of those are considered fossils. Most fossils are going to be found embedded in sedimentary rock. Sedimentation is the erosion of rocks produces an accumulation of particles called sediment. Sediment becomes a stratum, or just a layer, and any given stratum is going to be older than the one layer above it and younger than the layer immediately below it. So the dating of the stratum allows us to date fossils. Most fossils consist of hard parts. So most fossils are going to be made of going to be made of things like shells, bones, or teeth, preserved, sorry, words are hard this morning, preserved by a process called mineralization. This is where we're going to slowly replace the components of the original organism with minerals. Paleontologists are scientists who study fossils. The fossil record is a history of the life recorded by fossils, and paleontology is simply the science of discovering those fossils. Prokaryotes were the very first signs of life in the fossil record. These were followed by a single-celled eukaryotes and then multicellular eukaryotes. Fishes evolved before terrestrial plants and animals. On land, non-flowering plants preceded the flowering plants. Amphibians preceded the reptiles, including the dinosaurs. Transitional fossils have characteristics of two different groups. They tell us who is related to whom and how evolution occurred. So, for example, here we have the Ticotoc rosé. This is an organism considered a transitional fossil. He has some characteristics of an amphibian tetrapod. So he has some characteristics like the neck bones, having a flat head. So some of these characteristics match the early amphibians. However, a lot of these characteristics also match fishes. So he is considered a transitional fossil, a fossil that is somewhat halfway in between two different species. So Archaeopteryx is another great example. Oh, here. So, backing up. Archaeopteryx is another great example. Those fossils are intermediate between birds and reptiles. The dinosaur-like skeleton had reptilian features like jaws with teeth instead of a beak and a long jointed tail, but it also had impressions of feathers and wings. Another great example of transitional fossils would be the earlier whale ancestors, Ambulochus natans. This was the size of a large sea lion with broad webbed feet that could both walk and swim. It had tiny hooves on its toes and a primitive skull and teeth of early whales. So here are fossils that show some of the terrestrial ancestors for whales. Here is the early Ambulocetus. So he had early legs that would have allowed him to walk on land. Over time, of course, we have the Basilosaurus, who had some of the same skeletal structure but did not quite have the full appendages. And eventually we have the modern day whale. Here is the fossil Archaeopteryx. Here is the head that has a skull and jaw that is very similar to most reptiles. However, it has wings with clear impressions of feathers found in the rest of the organism. Here is an artist's depiction of what Archaeopteryx may have looked like. So another source of evidence for evolution would be biogeographical evidence. Biogeography is the study of the distribution of plants and animals in different places. So this looks at how individuals who are found in similar biogeographies or found in similar environments, but in very different locations of the world, have evolved to be adapted to that environment. So, for example, we will see a lot of different marsupials found in Australia. Now, each of those marsupials is going to be very different. They're all going to be adapted to their particular environment, but we're going to really only see marsupials found in Australia. Another great example of biogeographical evidence is we will also see that anywhere we have sort of wide open grasslands and plains, we're going to see very similar types of organisms. So when we have great big grasslands, we're going to have large very, very large herbivores that are going to graze. So that would be the buffalo in North America, or elephants, and antelope, grazing animals over in Africa. So we're going to see that just depending on the biogeography is going to determine the inheritance and the natural selection of certain types of traits. Anatomical evidence is also a really strong level of evidence for natural selection. Vertebrate forelimbs have many different functions. They can be used for flight in birds and bats, swimming in whales and seals, or running in horses. But all vertebrate forelimbs contain the same set of bones organized in similar ways despite their very dissimilar functions. So this is considered strong anatomical evidence in support of evolution. Homologous structures are structures that are anatomically similar because they're inherited from a common ancestor. So the more closely related the organism is, the more similar their anatomy will be. Analogous structures are structures that serve the same function, but they are not constructed similarly, nor do they share a common ancestry. So example would be wings of birds and insects. They serve the same function, but they are very, very different in their structure, very different in their, they have similar structure, but very different function. So homology, not analogy, means that organisms are related. So homologous structures indicates relation. Analogous structures doesn't necessarily mean that they are related. Vestigial structures are fully developed in one organism but are reduced and may have no function in others. So a great example of this would be whales have vestigial pelvic girdles and the legs. However, their ancestors walked on land, but the whales are completely aquatic now. Humans have a tailbone but no tail. This occurs because organisms inherit their anatomy from ancestors and are traces of organisms' evolutionary history. This slide reviews analogous and homologous structures, and we'll pick up with this in our next